beef is king, and it's expensive, but the consumer says it's worth it. This isn't a supply issue yet. The supply issue's yet to come. Imports of beef in the long run actually make USDA prime, choice, and select beef more expensive, not less.
All right, welcome back to Smokeless. I'm Nick. I'm here with Wayne. Fortunately, Justin could not make it. He had a mission on American Airlines to take Brisket to New York City, I think. Yeah, we're just rolling with me and Wayne, and we're deep into our investigation of the 2026 beef crisis. And in the last two episodes, we heard two very different explanations for how we got here. Bill Bullard from RCAF told us the market's broken. It's a rigged system where packer power and imported product can keep prices high for us, even when ranchers are getting squeezed. Commissioner Sid Miller came in swinging with an America First playbook. Rebuild the herd, label the beef, stop outsourcing the problem. But today we're moving past the speeches and into the spreadsheets. Our guest today is Lance Zimmerman. Lance is the senior beef and animal protein analyst for Rabobank, one of the biggest agricultural lenders on the planet. This is the guy banks call when they need to know what's actually going to happen, not what people hope happens. Lance spent over a decade at CattleFax, and he also worked at Certified Angus Beef, so he understands the premium product that we live and die by. Lance, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. And perhaps maybe the most pertinent part of the introduction is also grew up on a farm and ranch in western Kansas and still a part of that today. My brother runs it. But we have a farm in the western half of Kansas with 150 mama cows, and then we raise wheat and corn as well.
Lance, we need a reality check. There's a bit of a paradox. If ranchers do what Bill and Sid want and start keeping heifers back to rebuild the herd, it's fewer cattle hitting the market in the short term, and those are the cattle we likely need for premium briskets. So are we all rooting for a solution that makes brisket even scarcer and more expensive before it gets better?
As a domestic beef supply, about 2/3 of what we consume as beef in the United States is from our domestic steer and heifer population. And that is born, raised, processed, all American. If it was born in Canada but ended up getting slaughtered and processed here, I'm not counting that in that 66%. And so the only way we can rebuild the herd is you got to take, again, just like in the human side of things, most pregnancies are 50-50, steers and heifers over a large sample size. And the only way you can rebuild the herd is keep back some of those young heifer calves, develop them into mama cows.
It only goes in a fractional basis, right? Like if we're really trying to rebuild the herd, you're not just taking a single generation and then taking the mother heifer and putting it into market, just being replaced by the heifer calf. It's only a percentage of those would possibly be going into market, the calves, right? You're keeping still some more calf heifers to help increase at an increasing rate the herd size, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how lost you want to get in the numbers, but essentially what we look at when we talk about growing the herd is we're talking about mature beef cows. So females in the herd that have had one or more calves, right? And so as we look at those numbers over time, there's two metrics that we look at. One is called the culling rate of the nation's beef cow herd. And what that is it's the January 1 USDA reported number of beef cows. For January 1, 2026, it was just under 28 million head. And what we do is we look at, okay, based on that January 1 cow number, how many did we send to slaughter? The culling rate's there today. Unfortunately, the percentage of heifers we're seeing across all those different stages in the production mix are still in the mid to low 30% areas, which isn't quite where we need it to be saying we're rebuilding the herd. And so as a result, to your point, Wayne, we're still sitting here in a situation where the cow herd's basically steady to a little bit lower still as we look at where we've been both in 2025 and to start 2026 compared to where we were in 2024?
Okay. If we come at this from the angle of a barbecue restaurant and how this would affect us, we're narrowing our inquiry to a more premium product, high choice prime.
You're
Um,
speaking my language.
which right, your CAB background, I'm really interested in because they did some
Oh,
really
the
incredible
beef's too
things.
expensive to eat crappy beef. You're buying choice or prime, or you don't buy it at all.
Right, or right, at least in our industry, because that's what we've become. We've become an extension of the modern day steakhouse, like it or not. We're a
Mhm.
product of our own success in many ways.
Absolutely.
You know, um, but I think that what we're really looking at is the import beef isn't going to really affect us as far
Correct.
as I can tell. If it's mostly grind, it's lean meat that's going to be used primarily as burger, etc., then it doesn't affect what we do
Correct.
at all. So, but what is going to increase the herd size where we're at? Why are we stagnant when we have, you know, we still have a very strong demand for beef, maybe stronger.
Absolutely.
You know, this is something I was trying to get at over the last couple of interviews as well, is what is really driving that increase for or desire for beef consumption. And
Now you're hitting at it, Wayne.
right. I mean, because
Yep.
is it diet? Is it profitability? Is it health? Is it taste? Is it
Yeah.
is it prestige?
Price is a function of two things: supply and demand, right?
Mm.
Everybody's been saying, these high prices are because supplies are record low. Guess what? They're not. Cattle supplies have been drifting lower. The cow herd peaked cyclically in 2019. It's bottomed in here in this 24, 25, 26 period where statistically those numbers really aren't any different. When you look at the errors the government publishes in their cattle inventory reports, it's drifted a little lower, but it's within the statistical error of those all three being the same inventory essentially. But what really moves prices, and you alluded to this to some extent, is per capita beef supplies. And that's a fancy number that there's a few things that go into it. One, it's domestic production, slaughter times pounds, carcass weight equals production, minus exports. We can't consume in the US what we don't have, plus imports, which usually those two are offsetting. They haven't been recently. Imports have been exceeding exports. And then we divide it by the number of mouths to feed in the United States. What nobody's talking about is that per capita supply number. While we can talk about the mix shifting a little bit, and you rightly identified that, per capita supply has been almost flat since 2019, between 58 and 59 pounds a person. And so if supply is flat and prices are record high, you hit the nail on the head, Wayne. It's demand that's driving the record high prices today. Demand is the highest it's been this past year, 2025, since 1983. But numero uno is we improve marbling. Today, you buy beef as a consumer at the retail store, it's the highest quality beef on average you've ever had in your lifetime. We produce, it's over 6 pounds of prime and choice beef in the US for every 1 pound of select. Back up to 2005, it was 1.5 pounds of prime for 1 pound of select. And one of the problems that we all have when we talk about price is we want to talk about it in isolation. And I want to shake people when they do that. Because here's the problem: you and I, none of us darn well, better be making the same amount of money today as we did 10 years ago, right? It's
All right.
not a good trend. Beef prices have actually, when you convert retail beef prices, not just brisket prices, but retail beef prices to a minutes worked per pound of beef, it's creeping up towards the highs when you look at those metrics, the highs we would have seen both during the pandemic and back in 2014 and 15, but it's not outrageous. Um, And the other part of it is, and this is where your guys' struggle really becomes, how should I put this? A challenge. Retail's whooping restaurants' butts right now in terms of value delivery. And so if you're Joe or Jane consumer, and I'm going to use a steak as an example, you want to buy a nice upper 2/3 choice prime strip steak at a white tablecloth restaurant, your starting point is probably $75 for the steak. You're probably still buying the sides at a really good restaurant. You're certainly still buying the drink, and then you're gonna have a 20% tip if the staff does their job well, right? Maybe more if you're a generous tipper. That same steak costs you $25 at the grocery store and a little bit of time. Then you go buy $10 of sides. You have you a nice low ball with some bourbon over an ice cube in it.
Oh,
You're
yeah.
probably talking a $35 meal at home. $35 versus what's easily $125 total bill per meal at restaurant. Relative value. Retail is kicking restaurants' butt at the steak level. And so what I tell folks in your guys' shoes, quit worrying about price because we're not selling lead today. We're selling gold when we put it on a plate, and it's justifiable. And the consumer's saying, yeah, dang it, beef is more expensive than that pork butt, which I love a good pork butt done well. I love smoked chicken wings. We do them here at my home. The most underrated protein to cook on the smoker is boneless, skinless thighs. But beef is king. And it's expensive, but the consumer says it's worth it. This isn't a supply issue yet. You guys are hitting on it and alluding on it. The supply issue's yet to come. Right now, it's just record demand.
So, whereas Wayne asks really super smart questions, I'm going to ask the really dumb question here.
No dumb questions, Nick.
But how do you measure demand?
We can count cows. We can count slaughter. We can count beef production, slaughter times carcass weight. We can even get whittled down to that per capita supply metric I talked to you about. Demand is different because it's not per capita consumption. Per capita consumption is actually a supply metric. Demand is not just price because all else equal, if supply just drops, price should go up, right? A tighter supply should motivate a price increase. And so what demand actually is it's asking two questions at the same time. It's saying, how much product do I want? And based on that, how much am I willing to pay for it? And so to evaluate demand, when I'm telling you demand bottomed in 1998, it's grown to the highest level we've seen now since 1983. And what we're going to do is based on how supply changed from that reference year to the next, how should price have moved based on that supply change? And what they'll do is they'll use what we call an elasticity. And if any of you stayed awake in your macroeconomics 101 classes, an elasticity is actually a scientifically measured price response for how prices change based on a change in supply. If the price response disappointed relative to that research that we have, published journal research on elasticities for beef, then it's a demand break, a demand decline. What I'm telling you is for the last 20 plus years, almost 30 years now, demand has improved. The price response has exceeded what we would normally expect based on past consumer research on beef. And I think part of that is beef's the only protein in the meat case, with maybe the exception of seafood, that has an inherent flavor profile, right? Chicken tastes like what you put on it. Pork, even to some extent, largely tastes like what you put on it. Beef, you could put beef on the smoker, not put a dang thing on it, and it's still going to taste like beef, right? I mean, of course, we want to put seasonings, we want to do some fun rubs, things like that. But at the end of the day, you could put beef on there naked, and a good cut of beef is still going to perform after it comes off the smoker. You certainly can't say that about chicken in most cases. Some pork cuts, you can get away with that. And I think that matters. I think the other part of this that's important for us to realize that's working against your guys' clientele and colleagues, I should say, is we've seen a surge in retail demand for briskets. The pandemic taught everyone how to cook. And if it didn't at least teach them how to cook, they geared up. They now have a pellet smoker, a wood burning stick smoker, a Blackstone, a sous vide machine, an air fryer, an Instapot, and the pandemic taught them how to use it. We can debate how well it taught some consumers how to use
Right.
it.
Well, I mean, I can correlate that to our menu. We're doing everything we can to provide options that are not brisket, right? Like we serve breakfast. We have items on our breakfast menu that start without brisket. And then below that, we have the extra price with the brisket on, which makes it much more. And that's still what we sell the most of. The items that have brisket, they want it. But inherently, as pitmasters, we're still terrified of hitting a price ceiling. There's a point where we feel like the demand for this stops working. But I mean, are we just in a place where quality is going to trump the price for good, that they're just going to keep wanting it? I mean,
Yeah, great question. For now, we're okay. And what's fascinating is I mentioned that beef elasticity.
yeah.
There was a lot of work done with elasticities across different types of beef, cuts of beef, at the retail level, at the wholesale level, which is where you're shopping to buy your product, even at the ranch level with different types of cattle. So what happened in that 2017 study is it started showing that beef relative to pork and poultry were no longer good substitutes. Pork and poultry were still good substitutes with each other. In other words, if pork got way too expensive relative to chicken, they'd flock to chicken or vice versa. But beef, that cross price elasticity relationship was breaking down to the point that beef was kind of standing out on its own. That would kind of get at what you were alluding to, Nick, in a real world sense, being supported by the academic research. The other thing that was fascinating, which brings me to the point of, do we need to be worried about pricing ourselves out of this market, is it showed that as long as consumer incomes stayed steady or increased, they didn't care about the price of beef. When things got tough from a consumer income perspective, that's when you had to start worrying about beef prices. And so that means two things. We need to be much more sensitive to our beef pricing in periods where we hit a recession or an economic slowdown. And we need to be much more sensitive to beef pricing when we know the consumer has a lot of demands on their income. And so, to your point, some of those things kind of exist today.
Definitely.
But is it a perfect red herring? Probably not. There's still a segment of the population that's doing well. And so I think it's warranted to be sensitive to some of those challenges that the consumer's facing. But if we start seeing signs that the economy is really rolling again and that some of those concerns aren't necessarily what we thought they were, then we can continue to charge ahead. But I think the biggest thing that I see, even considering that research, is if you're going to have beef on your menu, it darn sure better be good. Like I said,
Right.
beef's too expensive to settle for select or settle for, some imported product that doesn't deliver on quality attributes. Every study that you look at when you ask beef consumers why they buy beef, taste and value are always at the top of the list. And everything else is secondary or even third string down the list in terms of what they care about most. Even with all this drive for sustainability and all natural and organic, those attributes tend to work their way down to the bottom of the list. They're distant compared to taste and value. And I think that that's where barbecue wins. That's why it's such a popular destination for consumers even today.
Well, I think we can definitely see in a real world perspective what demand looks like. What, at least in the socioeconomic brackets that we draw, we can gauge based on just traffic and demand. I mean, if we're cooking enough food, if we're cooking enough briskets such that we don't sell out every day, then we can get a true measure of how many pounds we will sell per day per cap. and year over year we can trend that as well based on what that traffic looked like last year, what those demands were. And so by following this curve, we operate in cycles. There's annual seasonal cycles that we deal with.
Absolutely.
And so we can project those. What is tough and what you were talking about is that disposable income level by which those who can afford, what is the break point for them? Because as the disposable level lies flat, people's income has been flat now since it spiked, shortly after COVID. We saw an increase just to try to get people to go back to work, right? I mean, we saw it in our industry.
Mhm.
Our hourly rate jumped up almost double. So, but it's not keeping pace with the inflationary cost of these items.
Correct.
It's flattened out. And so we're losing purchasing power over time,
Yes and
right?
no. I mean, you got to remember pricing is relative. I mentioned it earlier in two different ways, right? I mentioned let's
Mhm.
not talk about just beef price. Let's line it up with incomes and talk about how many minutes does the consumer have to work to pay for a pound of choice beef. And I told you those are
Right.
pretty comparable today versus what they were at some other highs, but not beyond that.
Right. But I was really looking at it from what we're offering at a per pound price versus what our guest is willing and able to pay on a recurring
Yeah.
basis. So what I'm seeing is people. I live in a poor area of our
Yep.
county, and this makes us, you know pricing then becomes a bigger issue, right? Um, they still want to come. They still eat beef, but are they coming once or twice a week?
Yeah.
They're coming once or twice a month.
Hmm.
So this is how I know that we're at that threshold where I also know that people in my area, their incomes have been fixed, and we've had to increase pricing over the last 18 months, um, especially this last 12 months.
Yeah.
Nobody likes that, and we hear that. And so we get direct feedback from people either through reviews or direct one-on-one conversation saying
Right.
pricing is too high.
Yeah.
It's just too high. So I think that it's relative. Um, the the price inelasticity of an individual is relative to not only their income level but the community in which they
Yeah.
live.
That's fair.
So if you're in a say if you're in a suburb or you're in some more high level, high income areas of a city, a larger city, being located at in or near those pockets is beneficial because you're locating people both with the disposable income and the time to come see you. And I think that, when I talked about, what's driving demand earlier, especially for our product line, and you talked about, well, marbling. It's the fat. It's the fat, stupid. Well, yeah, it's the fat, stupid.
That should be a
It is,
shirt. You
right?
guys should offer the merch.
And so if you're how this is affecting people in small town barbecue restaurants versus people in larger urban areas, I think I'm beginning to see a fleshing out difference in what demand looks like and how it's very elastic. They're bouncing all over the
Mhm.
place. Um, they're not willing, I don't think, um, that line, that point of differentiation of we'll go once a week versus we'll go twice a month is it's a sliding scale based on that disposable income tree. And that's less dependent on, your hours or minutes worked per pound of brisket sold or your whichever variable you
Yep,
were
yep.
using. Um, only because when they're flat, they're just flat in the poor areas. In the high income levels, their income is rising at almost an increasing rate. It becomes less of an issue.
Yeah.
I think that there almost has to be different pricing strategies within the industry itself, depending on where they're regionally or where their community is located.
But at the end of the day, Wayne, it comes back to the cost of production, right? Can we vary price based on demographics? That I'm not. That becomes a political argument, right? I mean, at the end of the day,
Oh,
the market
I
pays what
wouldn't
the
try.
market would
Yeah,
pay, right?
right. But if your resident total, the nominal number of people continues to shrink at a price level, then you price yourself out. If you have to go into that price zone and there's only 7 people in your entire county that can afford it, then you're just not going to make it.
Yeah, it means being as a
You won't have the
restaurant
traffic.
operator, being responsive to your demographic, right? And for
You,
some demographics, what it might mean is what I would strongly say based on my experience, and I've had the opportunity to work with major restaurant companies all the way down to cow-calf producers and everyone in between, from distributors to steak cutters to processors to feed yards. Um, what I advise folks at the end user segments is be very cognizant of making up the mind for your customer and try not to do that as best you can. But you still have to adjust where appropriate, which I think is what your point is, Wayne. Maybe you're not taking brisket off the menu, but instead you're going to only offer it during your peak season or the peak days within your week. It's going to be a Friday, Saturday, Sunday item, but we're not going to run it on these other days. Or, it's going to be a by request type deal, something along those lines, or you're just going to run lower volumes in those items. And when you run out, you run out. But I think one of the biggest things that I joke with folks is it's quick to tell what national casual dining chains are the ones that are getting ready to go on life support, because what you see is they go from a choice, usually it's a choice sirloin, strip loin at best, to a select. So all of a sudden, they don't even put the grade on the menu anymore. And then all of a sudden, they go from, let's say it's 5 SKUs that have a beef cut in them. I'm going to put ground beef in a separate category, to 3, to 2, to 1. And then guess what? Bankruptcy. And
but they are doing that on a national
on a
level.
national level, those are national chains,
Right.
in my experience. Yeah,
For sure. I'm looking more at regionally at largest, but community by community.
yeah. You have to know your customer at the end of the day, whether it's restaurant business
Yeah,
or a rancher. You got to know your target audience and produce to it with reckless abandon.
as best you can.
Yep. Yep.
And we can try to educate as much as we want. People will listen or they won't.
Yep.
So you're right. I mean, they look at a price, they have a price in mind, and if it doesn't meet their expectation, then everything better be perfect, or there's
Right.
going to be backlash.
Absolutely. And I think that's why marbling has been such a beneficiary to demand. When I worked for Certified Angus Beef, we often talked about marbling's like its own little insurance policy. And what I mean by that is, um, you're not the world's greatest cook. Marbling provides some fudge factor for you. Just the other night, you guys are going to cringe, but I have a pellet smoker because I don't have time to babysit a stick burner, and it offers a lot of flexibility. And I had some really nice 1.5 inch thick pork chops on the grill, and time got away from me. I usually have it down to a science. It's 20 minutes flip, 20 minutes, and they're off. Just grilling them on the pellet smoker, and time got away from me, and they got a little bit overdone. Instead of being 135, they were about 150 off the grill, and I was cringing. But you know what? That extra thickness provided me an insurance policy. Marbling does that for beef. and it helps ensure that the muscle density is not as much as it is because you have that fat in there. The juiciness provides some lubrication factor and all of that, and I think that's huge, especially when we're serving a product at retail and we're up to the consumer to do it. But even some benefits at food service. One of my big concerns as a beef industry right now, to make up for some of the decline in cattle numbers, we've increased carcass weights, and we've done so in dramatic fashion. Typically, with where cattle sizes are today, a long run uptrend in carcass weight means we'd add 4 to 5 pounds a year. Last year, we added 25 pounds to carcass weights. The year before, it was very similar to that. The side effect of that is there's two different ways to
Steakhouses
view.
go
Yeah,
nuts,
there's two
right?
different ways to view beef production. One is tonnage, and tonnage is fine if you're buying chucks, you're buying round cuts, you're buying even sirloin, because we're going to fab those around and we're going to make the cuts we need work based on that tonnage. But when you talk about briskets, skirts, flanks, strip loins, tenderloins, and ribeyes, those 6 key items, they're piece count driven as much as they are pounds driven, right? And
Yep.
there's only so many ways you can fab a strip loin. There's only so many ways you can fab a ribeye. In fact, I heard of some white tablecloth restaurants doing what sounds like a cardinal sin to me. Some of my bankers took some clients out to eat, got ribeyes, and they landed on the plate, and the splanalis was trimmed off of them, the cap. And I'm like, man, I'd have
No.
punched somebody if it was me, probably. Like, don't you take the splanalis? But they were doing that because they were trying to hit a specific
The weight
ounce
rate.
and keep the thickness
Yes.
of that cut intact. Because we all know the thicker the cut, the more forgiving it is. You have some limitations to that you're going to start bumping up against, specifically on those middle meat items where you can't just make them work on a plate or even make them work in a retail tray very well to hit a volume that you need without making them as thin as fajita steak. And that concerns me.
Yeah.
It also concerns me from an animal welfare standpoint. As we look at what we're doing as an industry.
You guys mind if I jump in and go a completely different direction here real
Go
quick?
for it. I'm okay with it if Wayne is.
Yeah. Bring it.
If you have anything to follow up, Wayne, something struck me, and you know me. I just jump in. Both of the last guests, Bill and Sid, both were hammering on mandatory country of origin labeling, saying that this was absolutely something that has to be done to change things. I mean, I think it's a great idea anyway, just so people understand what they're getting. I think everyone is more comfortable knowing, that they're getting a premium product, especially it's from the United States. But in your view, if it passes, does it actually lower brisket price, or is this just mainly reallocating margins for everybody?
Couple things. I'm not a champion of mandating anything. Typically, when we mandate things, that comes with unintended consequences. I don't like legislating change with a stick. I'm a disciple of certified Angus beef. I worked there for 8 years. I raise really high quality Angus cattle on our operation. CAB did not come about in this marketplace because somebody legislated it. Instead of being a stick, it was the carrot. And they built that brand because they felt like the Angus breed had quality attributes about its genetic base, its inherent marbling and flavor profile, that if they could identify those premium genetics through high quality beef in the marketplace, they would create a demand structure that would allow everything else to grow after that. I want to see a system that's based on demand. And instead of a mandatory system, starting on January 1 of this year, 2026, the government created a voluntary labeling system.
Voluntary.
And not only that, but President Trump said, I'm going to authorize the USDA to have a $150 million advertising campaign to promote made in the USA agricultural products. We tried mandatory country of origin labeling about 20 years ago, and the industry tried really hard to make it work. It was brutally expensive because it's incredibly difficult to track beef through the system. I mentioned earlier, 66% of our domestic consumption is U.S. born, raised, and processed steer and heifer beef, grain-fed young cattle. About 16% is U.S. cull cow and bull beef.
Those are not the ones that are ever going to end up inside a box of brisket that we get anyway.
The Canadian and Mexican cattle could. If those cattle came in, Canadian beef, most folks wouldn't be able to tell the difference between Canadian fed source beef and American fed source beef. Mexico, we imported about 1 million head of cattle from Mexico a year, up until just recently due to New World screwworm, as I'm sure Sid talked about. Most of that product's select grade. Not all of it, but a good chunk of it is. And so it could end up at a restaurant. The other imported product, primarily Australia, Brazil, New Zealand, Argentina, Uruguay, yeah, that's not ending up in most restaurants in whole muscle cut form. In rare instances, it might. If you're wanting a grass-fed product, quite frankly, those countries can do grass-fed and finished cheaper than we can in the U.S. And so it may be if you're purchasing for a grass-fed program, but in all those cases, you're probably going to know it because it'll be marketed as such. And so
right, everything that I've seen is that way. It'll say, New Zealand grass-fed beef or whatever.
Yeah, the problem becomes with that mandatory program that existed. There were a couple problems with it. So much time has passed since I was initially part of the supply chain that I may be missing some details. But the biggest problem with it was mandatory labeling was required of retail, but not food service and not further processing. That was immediately a flaw in that program because it picked winners and losers. It added a massive cost burden to everybody supplying into grocery stores. But if you were a food service distributor or selling to a food service distributor, immediately you got a free pass. If you were a restaurant, you didn't have to put anything on your menu. I don't like that. I don't like I don't like bad legislation that picks winners and losers based on cost.
So why does you think that it's so important to them as a way in which to replenish the herd and to fix this?
All right.
And why do they say it is essential to help the small rancher survive?
Yeah. We're all sitting down. Listeners, be sitting down. Imports of beef in the long run actually make USDA prime, choice, and select beef more expensive, not less. Most cow-calf producers are selling calves that go into prime, choice, or select. Those calf prices also go up with imports. Now, all of you should be asking, why? How could that be? Well, guess what? Of those steers and heifers that we slaughter in the United States, is anybody, Nick, Wayne, you want to venture to guess how much of that carcass is what we call 50% lean beef trimmings, 50% lean, 50% fat? Any venture to guess what percent of that carcass is 50% lean beef trimmings?
No.
10%?
Wayne hit it on the head. Winner, winner. 10% of that carcass, 10% of the value of that carcass is 50% fat, 50% lean. Guess what that's worth if we can't blend that with our domestic cull cows and bulls or imported product? It's worth rendering value because we're going to try to put it in dog food. We're going to try to do something with it. We may separate the beef out, separate the tallow, use the tallow to drive renewable diesel, and then try to do something with the machine separated muscle tissue for grinding. But it's incredibly less valuable without those imports on the other side. And what we're going through right now, I mentioned the cow herd peaked in 2019 and it's in a cyclical low. We go through these 10-year cattle cycles, and we could talk more about that if your listeners haven't heard from that from another source that you've interviewed yet. But we go through these cyclical lows in the cattle numbers. We're pulling back cow slaughter, cow and bull slaughter, those cull cows that are no longer productive. If we don't have an avenue in those times to push these 50s trimmings and 65s trimmings to make a really tasty fast food burger, then those 50s are worthless by comparison. And so what happens is imports allow us to balance out these ebbs and flows in our cyclical cull cow slaughter so that we still have a home for that low valued, low percentage lean, high percentage fat trimming. And that's what gets lost in this discussion. We let the emotion of, by gosh, we have to have made in America, we have to have only USA beef, become this emotive, policy-driven discussion, which at the end of the day, we actually are better off because we do have imports coming in. And all of this rhetoric that's taken shape, really it's heated up since about October about imports in this industry, has completely missed out on the empirical research that shows exactly what I told you. And at the end of the day, you guys knew this already. What we import in from an Argentina, an Australia, a Brazil, a New Zealand, where we're wringing our hands over this as an industry and we're so shook up over it, it's ending up in a fast food burger or a frozen patty, not even in the fresh meat case at retail, or it's ending up in a soup can, one of those, soups that you buy right down the aisle. It's ending up in a frozen entree at retail, or it's ending up in some kind of other further processed, lower quality item that we would serve at a lower end food service establishment. And I think
so without the imports, do they have to use the quote unquote good cows, I guess, to meet?
We'd have to, yeah. I mean, here's a fascinating thing right now to kind of wrestle with. I mentioned New World screwworm. I'm sure Commissioner Sid Miller mentioned this as well. We halted imports of Mexican cattle in late November 2024. We reopened the border briefly from February to April, and then we pretty much shut it off for one week in July. We tried reopening again, but we basically not been importing Mexican cattle into U.S. feed yards essentially for the better part of 12 months. We've lost basically 800,000 to 1 million head of cattle on feed from Mexico as we shut off those imports. All of my statistical models suggested the market was going to start feeling the loss of those Mexican cattle in October. And the data is starting to bear that out. We don't know with definitive information how many Mexico origin cattle we're slaughtering in the US day in, day out. We know how many are coming in. We don't always know when they're reaching a slaughter weight, but we do know most of those cattle come in as lighter weight, 400, 500 pound calves, and they're on feed about 300 days. And so that's why I know starting in October, we were going to really start to feel that supply not be in the market anymore. Since October 1, USDA select production is down 25% year over year. Guess what's coincidentally up in its place? More beef imports from both Canada and Mexico. Because to your point, Nick, there was a void. And as much as we all want to eat the highest quality beef possible on this call, we also have to recognize what Wayne mentioned earlier. There's a customer for every item we produce. And there is a customer that needs a consistent supply of lower quality grain-fed beef. And that customer isn't able to get it dependably in the U.S. today. And so they're having to increase beef imports from our partners north and south of us because beef's unique. Beef is not like corn. Beef is not like bananas or tomatoes. What I mean by that is wherever your bananas come from at the grocery store, they look like bananas at every other grocery store in the US for the most part. Corn. We export corn, we import corn. It's kind of the industry standard is number 2 grade yellow corn. It looks the same no matter what country you get it from within reason. Beef's not that way. It's not a homogeneous product, right? What we primarily consume at our high-end food service and almost all of our grocery store meat cases is U.S. product. With some exceptions here and there, it might be North American product, but almost entirely U.S. fresh beef, grain-fed beef. After that, you open up the floodgates to a lot of different varieties and a lot of different fill-in product here and there, but a lot of that's processed, and that's where that to come full circle, that mandatory country of origin labeling law gets really sticky, because it starts to get hard at the level of we talk about ground beef production. It's domestic trimmings that we're blending. We're bringing in some imported trimmings in some cases, but it's rarely at the grocery store level. Even our fresh
Okay.
ground beef at the grocery store level is U.S. and at worst North American based.
So these imports generally, we're talking about making sure fast food stays affordable.
Fast food and further processed type stuff. Yeah, I mean, think about fast food, think about frozen entrees, think about prepared, like I said, prepared soups. Also, a big importer, not in all cases, but in many cases, are a lot of the beef sticks you buy at the convenience store as you're checking out the grocery
Yeah.
store. The different blended meat sticks that exist in that beef jerky space even can oftentimes be imported product. So if it's further processed, value added in a lot of cases, it's typically an imported source.
So Sid was saying that, he was half joking, but he's like, there's 2 million cows we could let in here right now, and he's trying to do it.
No, maybe did he
The
say
the
2 million or did he
screwworm was,
say 200,000?
maybe he said 2 million briskets, meaning
Oh,
a
Yeah,
million cows.
I think he said 1,000,000 cows.
Okay, but and I understand. I'm hearing you what you're saying and how that's necessary, but is the risk of $100 billion screwworm outbreak worth rushing that? Is that like, how big is that threat?
yeah. No, that's a great question. So what's interesting is if you get the chance to ever talk to Texas feed yard operators or Colorado, Arizona, California, Oklahoma, New Mexico, they already
Mm-hmm.
felt the effects of New World screwworm last year because their feed yards today now are running 5 to 15% below year ago levels from a capacity standpoint. The pens are empty. And again, those cattle are typically on feed 300 days. So even if we opened the gates and we allowed Mexican cattle into the United States tomorrow, it's 300 days before those cattle
Yeah,
become beef, right? And so
yeah.
so that's also part of the calculus we all have to do. What's fascinating about screwworm, Nick, and this is a really good question. All the questions have been good, but this one in particular, um, the border wasn't closed primarily for animal health reasons. I would tell you the border was initially closed to put political pressure on Mexico to aggressively combat the screwworm. The screwworm got into Mexico from cattle supplies in Central America. I mentioned we typically import 1 million head a year from Mexico. Um, Mexico also imports about the same volume of cattle at their southern border from Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and those other Central American countries. And so what happened when we closed the border on Mexico was we were trying to send a message to them of, hey, take this seriously. Your high quality cattle that you want to export into the US aren't going to be able to unless you address the cattle that are a threat of bringing more New World screwworm into Mexico at your southern border. And so Mexico closed their southern border just as we closed
Mm-hmm.
ours off to them. And it effectively now has put a moat around Mexico's cattle supply to be entirely domestic. The challenge in that is now those producers that are used to exporting their higher quality breeding stock, usually Angus cross type cattle, north into the U.S. and get a higher premium can't. They're locked out of that market. But the only way we can reduce the threat of New World screwworm is to produce more male sterile flies. This New World screwworm fly, the female only breeds once in her lifetime. And going back to the 60s, we produced this sterile male fly that essentially produces semen without sperm in it. And that's probably being overly simplistic, but you're getting fly biology information from a beef cattle analyst. Take it for what it's worth. We need 500 million of those flies produced every week to push the
They're doing like
screwworm
100
threat
million
back
though, right?
south. We're at 200 right now. We get
Okay.
100 to
South
125
Florida.
million a week out of Panama being produced, and then they actually can produce more of the larvae, the little maggots, than they can grow into flies. And so now, as of a week and a half ago, they're shipping another 100 million larvae up to Texas, Moore Airfield Base in Edinburgh, Texas, Edinburgh. Your listeners will correct me. We're now rearing larvae we got from Panama in Texas to produce another 100 million. So we're up to 200 now. Mexico is going to have a facility that's operational sometime around the middle of the year to second half of the year. That'll move us to 300 million. And then the phase 2 of the Texas plant is under construction as we speak. That will actually make it not just a larvae development and fly dispersal facility, but it'll also put it in production of flies. And that'll take it up to an additional 200,000 flies per week. I always want to make sure I get my number of zeros right. That'll then get us up to the 500,000 a week we need. So I mention all that to say that's not going to happen until late 2027. So we're on the clock for essentially 2 years before we have enough ammo in our war chest to push this fly south. So that's just a baseline understanding. This is a concern for 2 years. What do we do in the meantime? The great thing is the last time we had this fly in the US, it was in the 60s when it was here in numbers that were critical to influencing the market. The fly is only a problem if cattle have a open tissue wound on them or exposed tissue on them in some form. Medicine's come a long way since the 60s. We have some products that are incredibly safe that will work for this fly, that the federal government, there's pressure on the federal government from all sorts of lobbying organizations to get them to just fast track these drugs for approval on New World screwworm prevention. They work well for face flies and all sorts of other flies with nearly identical biology. And what's great is you can administer them once and they're effective for 120 to 150 days. There's a lot of pressure on the government. Fast track those drugs so we can protect our cattle supply. But the reason I said this started much more as a political issue than an animal health issue is because we know we have some of those drugs that can work and keep that cattle supply safe. It's not a matter of if we get a screwworm case in the United States, it's when. But I bet it's probably not going to come here on cattle. I'd be much more convinced that it's going to come here through other natural means. Wind currents can carry it. Wildlife could carry it across the border. Humans are also surprisingly good transporters of vector-based drugs or vector-based animal health threats, I should say. That fly could just hop in the cab of a pickup with somebody unknowingly, drive across the border, and be here. And so the cattle supply limitations are to put pressure on the Mexico government. Today, I would say with that threat of New World screwworm moving up more so into the northernmost states in Mexico has probably shifted the balance. Let's say a year ago, it was 90% politically motivated and maybe 10% animal health motivated. Today, maybe that calculus has gotten a little bit more balanced, closer to maybe 1/3, 2/3, or 50-50. But I would still say a chunk of the reason that border is closed is probably more political than it is strictly animal health, because I do think we'll be able to control this much better than we did in the past when it was here. Don't want to discount the economic impact that it could have on production. We're definitely going to have to increase surveillance of livestock, use some of the the animal health products that are at our disposal, and that'll come at an added cost. But I don't think it necessarily has to be as catastrophic as maybe what we all think, as long as we do our job and are good at animal husbandry.
Yeah, because I mean, between Bill and Sid, they're talking catastrophic economic numbers of potentially $100 billion impact
And
in Texas alone.
And if I'm in their position as a government employee, as a politician, I'd
Yeah.
probably be yelling those talking points from the top of the roofs as well. I don't want to discount the fact that there will be an economic impact. And a lot of good people have probably run the numbers and done so very conservatively. But I do think as we navigate through this, there are tools in our toolbox that can work. I think the bigger concern to me is let's fast track for approval. Because again, much like we all lived through the pandemic, right? We all heard about
Yeah.
people yelling and screaming about using ivermectin to treat COVID. That was an off-label use of a product for a disease. This is the same challenge with screwworm. We have some products that are very effective. Some of them are actually, ironically, ivermectin based. But we can't get the government to get them approved fast enough for those other uses that we know will work effectively, because we've seen it work on other flies.
This is all so fascinating. It's just so wild the how different all three of you guys, the information and perspective, it's just crazy. Like it's
Yeah. I mean, what's fascinating about this industry, and I loved listening to your December podcast because you were eager to learn. And what's great about this industry is if you're willing to learn, if you're willing to be a student of the information, the US beef industry has volumes upon volumes of data available so that you can learn
yeah.
and you can educate yourself. And in many cases, the answers are there. You just have to know the right people that can point you in the direction to show you the underlying data. To me, the biggest concern that exists right now is not the threat that imports play on rebuilding the nation's cow herd. To me, the biggest threat to rebuilding the nation's cow herd that exists is we have a structural difference in the beef industry that doesn't exist in any other animal protein chain. Um, the very foundation of the U.S. beef industry is on very small farms and ranches. The average herd size in the U.S., and I think you hit on this on that earlier podcast, is right around 45 head. And in fact, to put this more contextually, 55% of cows in the United States exist in farms and ranches with less than 200 mama cows.
Mm-hmm.
And even if we're one of the best cow calf producers in the nation, you talk about probably having over 20 years an annual average return of $100 a head. Well, you can do that math. How many head would it take to have a $50,000 a year income from just the cow herd? Well, we can all do that math. That means you need to have 500 cows or more to have a long run average of $50,000 a year income from the cow herd. 500 mama cows, I can speak from experience with just, a couple hundred. 500 cows is a boatload of work at certain points in
Yeah, I
the
bet.
year. And it's really hard to motivate change as an industry if all you have are 40 head. Not to be at 40 head, it's a really essential hobby, a side hustle. You're not making family financial decisions with 40 head. But what's challenging is today at 40 head, let's say you have 20 heifers and 20 steers, as biology would dictate you should most years on average. Out of that 20 heifers, you need to find replacements. Well, the average industry average of culling rate is 10%. So each and every year out of those 40 head, 4 mama cows on average are going to town. for one reason or another.
Mhm.
They lost their calf, they didn't breed back, they hurt themselves, or they just were aging out of the herd. Minimum, long run average 4. So you have 20 heifers. If you want to rebuild numbers or grow the herd, out of those 20, maybe 10 of them are good enough to keep as herd replacements. And then it's just like our own lives, right? We're talking podcasts, so I'm guessing people on this podcast that are listening to it probably heard of Dave Ramsey before, the financial health guru. And I always appreciate that he said, without a financial emergency fund, every little problem is financially catastrophic. It's the same thing in the cow herd. When you're a small cow calf operator, every little problem can become catastrophic and every little problem can become almost insurmountable. Well, if you had 20 heifer calves, you decide 10 of them were high enough quality and uniform enough to turn into mama cows, all of a sudden the bull didn't breed some of them, or some of them just didn't successfully ovulate, or one of them broke its leg, or another one got sick, or one was pregnant. You had all the cost in it, and then at calving time, some freak snowstorm came the day she calved, and you lost the calf to hypothermia. Um,
Uh,
all of those things are debilitating when you have 40 head. When you have 400 and those things happen, the law of large numbers tends to work out. And those random things that typically only affect operations in ones or twos, threes or four kind of work out over time to not be as challenging. And I think that's really the pressure we're facing today, because the only choice for those smaller guys more often than not is not to develop their own replacement heifers, but buy them from somebody else. Unfortunately, those replacement heifers and bred cows are costing about $4,000 to $4,500 per head right now. Next fall, next winter, they'll probably cost about $5,000 a head. Calculating cyclical breakdowns in cattle price that we'll see as supplies eventually rebuild, it's going to be very hard for that bred heifer or cow at $4,500, even $5,000 to ever make a profit within the first 5 to 6 years of her life. And the reality is, every single year you lose a few cows, and usually you lose more younger cows as a percentage of their age contemporary group as you do older, because it's just how the natural process works. It's kind of natural selection sped up. Um, that's what's going through a lot of these smaller producers' minds today is, how can I make
yeah.
this work? And it's really hard. If you're a larger producer, you can develop those heifers on your own. Law of large numbers works out. You have a bigger group to choose from. You can rebuild much faster. But again, only about 45% of the nation's cow herd is represented by those guys with 200 head or more. So a lot of this rebuild is going to depend on motivating the biggest operators to rebuild. And we're getting there. I think we're starting to see the signs of rebuilding. It just hasn't shown up in the underlying data just yet.
So Bill's suggestions for fixes were very structural but slow. It was going to be, a 3 to 4 year cycle. Sid seemed to be a bit more urgent but very political, obviously. Um, in your job as an advisor, and you had to pick one intervention that would probably move the needle inside of this 12 months, what would it be?
Just one. Drive any of those major cow calf areas, and you can drive down a country road, and I can tell you whether that ranch is owned by the guy that has the cattle on it, or if it's rented by the guy that has the
Mhm.
cattle on it. And the reason I can tell you that is, the pasture that's owned by the same guy that has the cattle on it, it's got updated fences. It's got a windmill. It's got really good pond or stream water. It's got good infrastructure, good bones. The grass looks really healthy. You drive by rented pasture, the fences may not have been improved in the last 50 years. Some of the fences in western Kansas may be the original fences that the homesteaders put on those properties. The wires are broken, the posts are falling over. They're having to put a single kind of what we call electric fence around it as a temporary perimeter fence. The windmill's broken down. They're subject to basically hauling water to those pastures, or dependent on rains to fill a pond that needs some improvement. I mention that because those marginal acres, those rented acres, are the ones that are most in need of rehabilitation. It's low-hanging fruit. If we can make it more cost effective for producers to restock those, because again, water is just as important, in fact, more important in many cases than feed in supporting livelihood. Um, Feed's only part of it. There's a lot of pasture available out there that's not being utilized today because it's just too expensive to utilize. It's either too expensive from a labor standpoint because you're always trying to chase cattle back in a fence that's hard to keep up and available to keep cattle in, or you're having to haul water because the water infrastructure is just not there. And so I think
Mm-hmm.
anything we can do, we have what we call equip programs in the government where we help farmers with infrastructure improvements on farms and ranches. We need to double down on finding ways to make it cheaper and easier to improve some of those rented acres because they're usually owned by absentee owners. And what I mean by that isn't a derogatory term, but grandpa and grandma passed away and then they handed the property down to their kids. And then when their kids passed away, they handed it down to their kids. You have a lot of absentee owner groups that are spreading this cash rent check across maybe 4, 5, 6 different families, and they haven't been back on the operation in 2 or 3 generations. They're just taking the rent check and they're using it as they should. That's their right, but they're not reinvesting it in improving those operations. And rental law is such that if a farmer or rancher is renting it and makes improvements on it, he can't recoup those improvements afterwards if he loses the rent of that ground. And so I think a big piece of this is let's let's invest in infrastructure to make some of these marginal acres easier to run cows on and drive cow costs down, especially for younger producers. Because today it's human nature. You see it in your business probably just as I do on farms and ranches. Those young restaurateurs, they're bigger risk takers. They have a bigger risk appetite. They're willing to gamble a little bit more than maybe the old stalwarts in the restaurant industry. Same thing's true on farms and ranches. We have a lot of aging producers today. The younger producers are the ones that they're going to rebuild this cow herd. One, because they have the energy to do it, but two, because generally speaking, they're more willing to take on risk. They're bigger risk takers because they see the opportunity that exists in the future. They're willing to lean into technology and other solutions to mitigate some of these problems in a way that maybe older generations aren't. And so I think infrastructure improvements, especially ways we can incentivize younger operators to get back into the business. And then also, I think in that same vein, what can we do to facilitate um, transfer of ownership to the from older generations to younger generations? What can we do to fairly value those assets, but get them in the hands of young producers who are going to do something really good with them? You have a lot of ranch owners today. I talked to one of our bank clients a couple weeks ago. He said, "Hey, Lance, I'm starting to wind down this business." And I said, "Hey, I get it. You're in your 60s. You want to enjoy the rest of your life, not be babysitting cows all the time. It's stressful." I said, "You have family to take over?" "No." "You don't have anybody?" "No, not really." Let's find some ways to offer some solutions there, where there's a lot of folks just like that. How can we make sure those ranches end up in the right hands? And those solutions aren't easy. And I hate to say that government needs to be a solution there, but I do think that there are probably some things we could do from a policy perspective that could go a long way. Um, at the end of the day, the cattle business is a family business. And so a lot of times what you're left with is looking for solutions that allow connecting the opportunity with the family. And I think that's really important today. Just the same stresses you all feel as restaurant operators day in, day out.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Those farmers and ranchers across the countryside today are feeling some of those same stressors. Margins in the cow calf business are really strong today, but there's a lot of concerns about what future profitability looks like. And again, they may have 40 head, 100 head of mama cows, but that usually means they're also either working another job in town or the cattle business is a side hustle relative to the grain business. And today, if you're trying to produce wheat, corn, soybeans, grain, sorghum, that those crops are not profitable. And so that small cow herd may be the only part of the whole farm enterprise that's making money. And I think that's key in this discussion about this rebuild too, that oftentimes gets missed. Very rarely are we talking about sole cow-calf operators. They're usually juggling a lot of different hats.
So
Man,
all of these small ranches that we've lost in the last 20 years, what size are they?
They're definitely smaller. You can look at the data, and I'm looking off to my left because I actually have a graph for this. Um, we have what we call the Census of Agriculture. The USDA administers it every 5 years. The last data we got was was representative of the year 2022, and so 5-year increments. If I draw a line in the sand for just illustrative sake in 1997, then you would have that census and 5 following it. The only demographic that is seen in terms of ranch size that we've actually seen total cow numbers grow is those ranches with more than 200 head. The demographic with less than 100 head has actually seen their total cow inventory represented by those small herds decline about 33%. Operations with between 100 and 199 head since 1997, they've seen the volume of cows in their operations decline 15 to 20%. Conversely, that 200 head and plus operator, over that time, they've seen the volume of cows in that demographic grow about 15 to 20%. So it's still a net decline over time in total, but certainly the pressures, as I mentioned, are disproportionately larger on those smaller operators.
Is this a consolidation of sorts? Are the larger operators purchasing the land and therefore the production capacity
Not
to
necessarily.
increase
I
their
mean,
herd size?
in certain cases, that's probably true. Um, but I think a lot of it is, as we look at the cow calf business, there's certain advantages to getting bigger. If you only have 40 head, um, as you can understand in the meat industry, you don't want to get, let's say you purchased 10 cases of briskets. You don't want a lot of variability among those 10 cases of briskets, right? You all want them to be relatively uniform in size, shape, and type. And, 10 cases of briskets, that'd be about what, 40 briskets? Are there 4 in a case or are there 3 in a case these days?
We get 5.
Oh, 5. Some of this consolidation we're seeing uh, is a natural evolution in just the cost structure to be able to get the highest return that you can based on how the markets evolve downstream. Um, and I mean, even our own operation is a perfect case in point. When I was a kid, we had 40 head. We're still a family operation, but we're sitting there at 3, almost 4 times that today. And we have some good rains and long range weather forecasts coming up down the road. If we can keep being in a good grass situation, we probably have capacity to push that from 150 head of mama cows closer to 200 down the road. So I think a lot of it is just the challenges of marketing, the challenges of logistics at those smaller scales.
Lance, this has been again just really fascinating, and I appreciate your time so much
Well,
in dealing with getting this scheduled. I hope that as we inevitably will have more questions, that's how I work. The way I process things, like I will come up, I will think of 3 things this week that it's like, oh, I should have asked Lance that. I hope that we can refer back to you if there's anything we need clarification on.
yeah, no doubt.
Um, this is a really complicated thing that we're all trying to get to the bottom of and just provide our friends and peers with some sort of pathway, something to hang on to some light at the end of the tunnel. And it doesn't sound like there really is any easy answer, but
Not for right now.
truly truly appreciate you doing your absolute best to teach us all and help us learn and navigate through this. I mean, we consider it a crisis.
I get it.
Um,
Yeah,
We're losing barbecue joints this year, and I'm sure there's a whole lot of reasons behind it, but everyone's feeling the pinch. So
I get it. Yeah, I mean, the only business that exists in the beef supply chain that's probably more volatile and challenging than raising cattle is literally the job you all do. And so I wanted to make the time to make this work. I'm glad we finally found the time.
yeah, thank you.
I love
Yes, thank
good
you.
barbecue, so anything I can do to support you and your colleagues in this space, I'm delighted to. I'm just too. I don't live on the family operation. It's too far away from easy airport access to do my travel for my
Yeah.
day job. I'm 2 hours straight west of Kansas City. So my mission is every time I go to Kansas City to try a different Kansas City barbecue joint. I know there's regional debates and differences, but I think we have more in common between Kansas City and Texas than we certainly do to more southeast style.
Well, thank you again so very much. It's great to meet you. I know
Likewise.
Justin is sad that he couldn't be here, but
Yeah,
he's
he
off
would
doing,
enjoyed it.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
we'll
Yeah,
have
he
to
would
do it
have.
again down the road and make sure he can be a part of it.
sounds
Well,
great.
brother, enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank
Thanks
you.
so much.
You too. It's been a pleasure. Have a great evening.